Hi, I'm Jason Duncan, and since you're watching this video, you probably want to know who I really am and how I got here. And now, this is not a sales pitch, it's not a marketing video, this is just my story, the real story of how a kid who wanted to design cars ended up helping and coaching business owners how to exit without exiting. But let me start at the beginning. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and I grew up in a small town called White House. And the funny thing is, after being away from White House for almost 26 years, my wife and I just moved back here last year. You know, sometimes life comes full circle in ways you really don't expect. But growing up, we lived modestly. My mom stayed home with me and my brother. My dad worked full-time for the phone company, and he was also in the Navy Reserve. And we weren't trying to keep up with the Joneses. And we had what we needed. Modest house, modest cars, camping trips for vacation, but what my parents gave me was something much more valuable than fancy things. They gave me faith, they gave me family values, and the understanding that relationships matter way more than possessions. Now, I've also known Jesus since my very first memory, and that faith has been woven through every chapter of my story, even when my path got very confusing. But as a kid, I really loved to draw cars. And I remember being 4 or 5 years old and drawing my dad's orange Volkswagen Beetle. I even have a picture of me standing in the front seat of that car, hanging onto the steering wheel, staring through the windshield with the biggest smile that you've ever seen. And that little Beetle sparked a love affair with cars that lasted into my entire adult life. I even owned several Beetles and restored a couple of them. But all my spare time as a kid and a teenager was drawing cars. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to design cars for the big manufacturers. And I did get accepted to 2 prestigious art colleges that had good industrial design programs that would have put me on the right path. But then something changed. Something that changed everything. You see, every summer from about age 10 to age 18, I went to church camp, first as a camper and then as a teenager in high school as a counselor. And the summer between my junior and senior year, I was a counseling at Camp Christian in Burns, Tennessee. And one night after we put all the kids to bed, I was hanging out with the other counselors, just talking, joking around, being kids. But I remember this moment so clearly. I had this overwhelming sense that this helping people, having fun doing it, specifically helping kids, sharing my faith, this is what I wanted to do for a living. So I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I turned down those art schools and I applied to a local Christian university for their youth ministry program. And in the fall of '93, instead of learning car design, I was studying youth ministry. And my first real taste of ministry came in the summer of '94 during an internship at a church in South Carolina. I was working alongside their youth minister named Jimmy, and I loved every part of it. The programming, the leading singing, the connecting with young people. I even preached to their congregation once. It was about 500 or 600 people. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at the same time. And my wife and I, Christy, we decided to get married. And we'd met on a blind date when we were 15 and 16 years old, by the way. We got married in May of 1995, and right after our honeymoon, we headed to another internship at a church in Fayetteville, Georgia, just south of Atlanta. Now, this time, I was the only youth minister on staff. No mentor, no guidance, just me, a newly married 20-year-old, trying to figure it out. And I enjoyed it. But the church was going through some changes, and they eventually split, which does happen sometimes. And I'm really glad I didn't stay, even though I probably could have. But we moved back to Tennessee, and I worked with our home congregation until I got offered a part-time youth ministry position in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, making about $1,200 a month. And after about a year and a half there, we took a big leap, and we moved to a small town in Louisiana, just north of New Orleans, by about an hour. And I had a full-time youth ministry position there. And we loved that church. But honestly, the culture of that town was so different from everything we'd ever experienced. We was like, I don't know about this. So we decided to move back home, for better or worse. For the next year and a half to 2 years, I stayed completely out of ministry, and I worked as a territory manager for an auto parts company. But ministry called me back. And this time, instead of youth ministry, I decided to pursue preaching, being a senior pastor. And I took a part-time preaching job at a small country church outside our hometown. After a couple years, they couldn't offer me full-time work. They simply didn't have the people or the money. So I started looking around the country, and I found a full-time preaching job in Nebraska, of all places. Now, honestly, I really didn't want to go to Nebraska, but I love those people and I love that church. That town was pretty cool. My son was just an infant. He was our first child, and moving away from the family was pretty difficult, but we took the leap. And we spent a couple years in that small Nebraska town, and it was challenging. And my wife's father, when he got sick, we decided probably needed to move closer to family. So we came home, and thankfully, a church in Gallatin, Tennessee had heard that I was back in town, and they offered me a full-time preaching position. So we moved to Gallatin. We ended up staying in that town for over 20 years. Our daughter was born there, and we loved the community, but I only stayed at that church for 4 years. You know, I really got fed up with the whole church machine vibe, and I wanted to make a difference in people's lives, but I didn't want to babysit adults who knew better. So I made another big decision. I left vocational ministry to become a school teacher. So I went back to school, got my master's in education. I started teaching 8th grade American history. And my first year, I taught at an inner city school in Nashville. And I was probably the only white man that those students ever really interacted with, but they liked me. And I absolutely fell in love with teaching them. Now, I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew I was making a difference in those kids' lives. The timing was interesting. My daughter started kindergarten that same year, which meant my wife, who had stayed home with both kids up to that point, had to go back to work full time to help with our finances. And then the next year, I moved to a school right down the street from where we lived. It would have been silly not to take that job so close to home. And I taught there for 3 years, and I fell in love with those students. I loved the parents. I loved the administration. Everything was going great until April of 2011. My principal came to my classroom and he sat me down and he delivered some devastating news. They weren't going to renew my contract for the following year. Budget cuts from the Great Recession meant they had to eliminate 2 teaching positions. And even though I was told I was the #1 teacher in the county, I was the last hired in that building and I didn't have tenure. I was crushed. And at first I thought I'd just find another teaching job, but there weren't any. I applied everywhere. Well, then I figured, I'll just go work in the corporate world. But here's where the story gets really interesting. A year before this happened, in March of 2010, a friend named Bill had approached me about starting a company. And we did, and we called it Future Vision Energy. He wanted to design an onboard hydrogen generator for automobiles. And I thought he was nuts. I was a social studies teacher. I'm not a scientist, but I did like cars. And he convinced me that we could work on it in our spare time without me ever leaving teaching. So I had the task of borrowing the money. So I borrowed $5,000 from a guy named Mike who I knew from riding motorcycles, and we bought the equipment to get started. And it wasn't really a money-making venture. We actually lost money, but we had fun with this side hustle. Now, fast forward to that devastating day when I learned I wouldn't be teaching anymore. I had to figure out how to bring income home for my family. I started interviewing for corporate jobs, but this business idea kept germinating in the back of my mind. And for some reason, LED lighting came across my desk as an opportunity. And since our company was named Future Vision Energy, I thought, maybe we could sell LED lighting as an energy efficiency play instead of this hydrogen generator thing that wasn't working. Now, Bill disagreed with me. So he and I separated. I kept the company and I retooled it to be an LED lighting retrofit company. I made a deal with my wife. I said to her, if I don't have a project locked in, I'm not making money by August 15th, I'll get a real job, or whatever that means. I'll go work at Starbucks or Lowe's or something. And I picked that date because it was my last paycheck from the county. Now, the guy who was interviewing me for that corporate job sensed that I really wasn't interested, and he terminated the interview process, even though I could have got the job. And that forced me to rely on my ingenuity, my entrepreneurship. Now, here's what happened. On August the 12th, I rode an elevator up to the 3rd floor conference room at a small regional hospital in Middle Tennessee, and I made the sales pitch of a lifetime. I was sitting at that conference table with Mike, who had become my minority partner to help me and guide me since he knew more about business than I did at the time. And about 2/3 of the way through my presentation, the VP of the facility services stopped me and he said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." "Has anybody ever told you no?" I said, "No, sir, they haven't." Now, what I didn't tell him was that he was the first person had ever asked. And then he said, well, why wouldn't I do this? After all, it's going to save me more money than it's going to cost. And I said, I don't know. I don't know why you wouldn't do it. Now, he looked down the conference room table at the CFO and he said, do you trust these guys? Now, the CFO said yes, even though everyone in that room knew, we kind of knew what we were talking about, but not fully. We didn't fully know what we were talking about. The VP turned back to me and then looked back at the CFO and he said these words. He said, write the man a check. Now, that first check was $18,000, nearly half of what I made as a school teacher. Now, that project turned into a $2.3 million project over the next 3 years. That day solidified my journey into entrepreneurship. And over the next few years, I put in countless hours making this LED retrofit company work. And we hit $1 million in revenue in our second year. And we were profitable every year up until 2018 when we made over $1 million in profit. We were doing projects in hospitals and warehouses and distribution centers all over the country. I had nearly 20 or so employees. I had an office in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Life was great. I was making good money. Everything seemed to be going well. At the end of 2018, in the beginning of 2019, I had a conversation with my business coach that really shook me. And I told him that I wanted to sell the business since we'd been so successful. I mean, after all, we'd made $1 million that year in profit. And he said to me, your business isn't sellable. I said, why? Because the same reason you want out is the same reason no one wants in. Your business relies too heavily on you. And he was right. No investor, no acquirer would ever pay what I would find acceptable because they want me to be involved and I no longer wanted to be involved. Now in 2019, my business partner and I had a falling out and I spent almost that entire year defending myself against potential lawsuits and financial settlements. I was putting about 25% of my effort into the business and 75% of it staying out of court and out of trouble. Now, at the end of 2019, something happened that hadn't occurred since our first year. We lost money. How could that be? I mean, the year before we'd made $1 million in profit. Now we'd lost money. And my business coach had called it. I was too critical as the hub of the business. I'd spent a year with my eye off the ball and the business suffered. And that's when I learned I had to exit the business, even if I didn't sell it. I made a commitment to turn the reins over to my leadership team and teach them how to run the company without me. Now, COVID, that was interesting in 2020. It interrupted our progress since after all, we'd been working in hospitals all over the country. But I was committed to this plan. And over the course of 2020, I was able to exit almost all of the daily operations. Other business owners wondered if I'd sold the business since I wasn't going to the office every day. And I'd say, no, I exited without exiting. And that's how that phrase was born, just my attempt to describe what had happened. And as I did this, people started asking if they could learn how to do the same thing. Now, most companies are owner dependent and they're not exitable. That's how I started coaching. Now, at first, I coached people one-on-one as they had needs. Then I started a group coaching program and I called it the Exit Accelerator. And I was showing people the steps that I took to get out of the weeds of daily operations. And then in the fall of 2021, I hosted a dinner for some of my students and clients who'd gone through my group coaching programs. And I pitched the idea of starting a mastermind called the Exeter Club. And to my amazement, 6 people said they wanted to join and they paid their dues. And we had our first meeting in January of 2022. Now, let me tell you about the constant through line of all this. She was my wife. She was my constant. And we met on that blind date when we were 15 and 16 years old. And we've been married since May of 95, over 30 years now. We have a 25-year-old son as I'm recording this. Our daughter's 22. And my wife has been my rock. She's been walking beside me through all these changes, moving across the country for different ministry opportunities, supporting me through the teaching phase and then into entrepreneurship and now into coaching. Now, it hasn't been easy. There have been times when we barely had enough money to pay the bills, and there have been times when we had more money than we knew what to do with. Now, I will admit, I like having money a lot more than not having money. But money isn't the most important thing, and that's what my family taught me when I was growing up. As long as I have my friends, my health, and my family, I'm okay. Now, here's the thing about my personal brand. the real Jason Duncan. When I set up my Instagram account in 2016 or 2017, I needed a handle, and just the name Jason Duncan was already taken. Now, I had seen other accounts using words like official or real, so I just chose the real Jason Duncan as the handle, and I had no idea it would become a personal brand. And a couple years later, a personal branding coach reached out to me and offered me a free consultation. After researching all my accounts, she said, "You know what I see? You're the real Jason Duncan. That's your personal brand because you're real. You're not fake. You're not putting on airs. You're not trying to present yourself as something you're not. You just show up authentically as who you are." And that was it. So I got the URL, therealjasonduncan.com. I had a logo design, and that's how the brand was born. Now, looking back at this journey from wanting to be a car designer to ministry to teaching to entrepreneurship to coaching business owners, I can see a common thread through all of this. I started as a minister and a pastor taking care of people. Then I became a teacher helping people learn and grow. Then I became a business owner learning leadership and operations. And now, as America's exit coach and the founder of the Exeter Club Mastermind, I get to use every gift and skill that I've learned over the past 30 plus years. I get to minister to people, I get to teach, I get to do business, and I'm paid well to do it on my own schedule. I'm doing exactly what I think God put me on this planet to do. If I'd stayed in ministry forever, I don't think I would have the fulfillment that I have today. The same with teaching. I mean, each chapter was preparing me for the next one, even when I couldn't see it at the time. And here's what I want you to take away from my story. Sometimes what looks like career confusion is actually career preparation. So don't be afraid of unexpected turns. They might be equipping you with exactly what you'll need later. I mean, I thought I wanted to design cars, but God had a different design in mind. Every pivot that I went through wasn't really a pivot. It was preparation. Ministry taught me how to care for people's hearts. Teaching showed me how to break down complex concepts. Business ownership gave me real-world experience with the struggles that my clients face today. And even that painful lesson about building a business too dependent on me became my unique expertise in helping others avoid that same trap. Now, if you're in a transition right now and you're facing uncertainty about the next chapter in your life, here's my advice. You don't have to have it all figured out from the start. Stay true to your core values. Mine has always been serving others. Be willing to take calculated risks. Trust that each experience is building something bigger, even when you can't see the full picture. The real Jason Duncan isn't someone who had a perfect plan and executed it flawlessly. The real Jason Duncan is someone who kept following the call to serve people, even when the path kept changing. And you know what? That's led me to exactly where I'm supposed to be. That's my story. That's who I am. That's what I do.